What is a country? What are continents? Depending on who you ask, when you ask, and where you ask it, you may get very different answers. But today, I'm just going to look at one source, FIFA, the international governing body of association football, more commonly known just as football, or in some parts of the world as soccer. The answer FIFA gives to this question varies greatly from what you might expect. It was certainly very different from what I, someone who was brought up in the United States, was taught to view as the continents and countries of the world. But I think that is exactly what makes it so interesting, shedding a light on not just the history of football, but the history of colonialism and the geopolitical divides that we call borders. So in this video, I'm going to go through all the continents, or continental football confederations as FIFA defines them, and pick out some unique examples that I think show the differences in how FIFA defines continents and countries and how many people typically define them. There are a few different categories that these often fall into. First, there are national football associations that are members of continental confederations that are not the right continent you might expect them to be. So for example, if Germany was in the Asian Confederation instead of Europe, that would be considered unusual. Now, I'm also going to look at countries where the national football associations are members of continental confederations and are members of FIFA, but they might not actually be recognized as sovereign countries outside of football. So for example, if the state of Texas had its own football association, that would be kind of weird because, Texas isn't really a country. And there are plenty of football associations for states in various different statuses that are not considered sovereign countries most of the time, but have their own football association. And I think that's a kind of unique and cool thing that will definitely be a big focus in this video. So I did my best to include most of the countries that fall into these categories or that are otherwise interesting, but I might miss a few, of course, and I'm just going by the official confederation member lists kept by FIFA. So, starting off alphabetically, the first continental confederation is the Asian Football Confederation, also known as the AFC. The AFC was formed in 1954 in Manila, the capital of the Philippines, and since then has governed football in the world's largest and most populous continent. One of the first football associations that caught my eye when looking through the AFC list is Palestine. You would expect Palestine to be considered part of Asia, of course, considering the wide-ranging scope of the AFC. As of the time I'm recording this, Palestine is not recognized as a sovereign country by part of the world. And there are governing bodies with varying levels of power in Palestine, but because of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land, there is not the kind of sovereign authority most countries' governments have, and they're not full members of the United Nations. But despite the lack of sovereignty given to the Palestinian people, they do still have a football association in the AFC, which I think is pretty cool. As for the Israeli Football Association, we're going to have to get to that later because they're not actually part of the AFC. Alright, so moving a little further east, there are some other examples of countries that are not recognized as sovereign in many cases, but are actually AFC members. The first two are Hong Kong and Macau, which both have their own football associations, part of the AFC, and they are internationally recognized as part of China, not their own countries, but they do have some more autonomy, so I can kind of understand why they have their own football associations. This kind of meets a general trend, which is that FIFA is pretty likely to include a lot of different national football associations, even if they don't represent a sovereign country. Continuing to look at China, there's also the more controversial case of the so-called Chinese Taipei Football Association, which is probably more recognizable to people in the global north as Taiwan's National Football Association. While most countries do not recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state, it does have a government which in practice acts independently of China. So for international sports such as the Olympics or football in this case, the country operates under the compromise name Chinese Taipei, which allows China to maintain their claim on Taiwan while granting them a separate sports team. Going even further east, we find another category which will pop up a few times in this video, which I'm going to call colonies for the most part. Most of the time, these examples are not officially classified as colonies, since that doesn't paint the colonizing country in the best light. But I think it's the most accurate term to describe places like Guam, which is officially considered a territory of the United States, but does have its own football association. Guam, despite being a Pacific island that could participate in Oceania's confederation, is a member of the AFC. And we will see plenty more examples of colonies which don't have political independence but do have separate football teams throughout this video. Wrapping up our journey through Asia, another interesting inclusion in the continent is Australia. Australia's National Football Association applied to join the Asian Confederation as early as the 1960s, but it was repeatedly denied. Eventually, they formed what is now the Oceania Football Confederation, which they stayed in until 2006, when they were allowed to join the AFC. This move helped them play more competitive opponents, avoiding the blowouts they were constantly dealing out in Oceania, including their record-breaking 31-0 triumph over American Samoa. Alright, so that wraps up our journey through the Asian Football Confederation. Next up, we have the Confederation of African Football, representing the continent of Africa. It was formed in 1957 in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, by founding members of Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, and South Africa. Originally, the existence of the CAF, usually pronounced CAF, was opposed by the South American Confederation, as they believed that the countries involved would only favor the interests of their quote-unquote colonial masters. But this dynamic began to change, as more countries in Africa gained independence and autonomy from their European colonizers. So today, there are 54 member associations in CAF, corresponding to the 54 internationally recognized countries on the African continent. So because of that, CAF doesn't have a whole lot of football associations whose existence itself I found to be specifically interesting or surprising. That isn't to say that CAF doesn't have any history of political controversy. Perhaps most notable is the suspension of South Africa's Football Association from 1961 to 1992 because of the country's racist apartheid system. Since apartheid ended, things have changed dramatically in South Africa, however, with them going on to host the 2010 World Cup. So there are plenty interesting things about CAF, but for the purposes of this video, there aren't too many unique inclusions to go over. So let's go ahead and just move on to our next confederation. The Confederation of North, Central America, and Caribbean Association Football, more commonly known as CONCACAF, covers a wide range of countries with many interesting inclusions. It was founded in 1961 through a merger of previously existing confederations, the one previously covering solely North America and the one solely covering Central America and the Caribbean. Included among these nations are two countries which are also located geographically in the South American continent, Suriname and Guyana. Despite the geographical discrepancy that it might seem like, this inclusion makes a lot of sense. The two nations both have very underdeveloped football teams, which wouldn't be able to compete very well in South America, and they have lots of connections to the rest of the Caribbean. CONCACAF also includes the representation of many different colonies who are not currently sovereign nations. Curaçao and Aruba, both parts of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, have their own national teams. Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, both considered territories of the United States, are also represented in CONCACAF. And the United Kingdom also has its fair share of colonies in the Caribbean which have their own football teams. This includes Bermuda, Montserrat, the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and the Turks and Caicos Islands. So, as you can tell when looking at the teams in CONCACAF, colonialism has definitely left its mark in the region. And while football gives these nations some representation of independence in the sporting world, in practice they are still governed and controlled by their colonizer. Moving further south, we have the South American Football Confederation, abbreviated CONMEBOL, for its Spanish name Confederación Sudamérica de Fútbol. It is the oldest continental confederation in the world, and it's known for hosting the Copa America, which sometimes includes guests from other confederations too. In terms of the number of countries, it is the smallest of any confederation, including just 10 countries within the continent of South America. CONMEBOL's founding members in 1916 were Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and Uruguay. The remaining 6 countries joined later in the 20th century, with Venezuela being the latest in 1953. Like Africa, South America's Continental Football Confederation doesn't have particularly surprising inclusions, simply representing the 10 largest South American countries. However, there are a few examples that perhaps under different circumstances would be part of CONMEBOL. The first is French Guiana, which is on the Caribbean coast of South America. Unlike other colonies, French Guiana has been formally incorporated as a department of France. For comparison, it has a status more similar to Hawaii in the United States, which is a state, while many of the other colonies of France that have their own teams are in a status like Puerto Rico, which is a US territory. So because of this further incorporation, French Guiana is generally considered part of France and does not have its own separate national team. On the other hand, there is another example that perhaps in a different geopolitical climate would have been internationally recognized as a football association. The Falkland Islands, categorized as a British overseas territory, has not been let into CONMEBOL as a member association. This is largely due to the territorial disputes regarding the islands, which Argentina claims and calls Islas Malvinas. Other countries in South America generally support Argentina's claim, at least as far as not recognizing the territory's football team. Speaking of islands, the Oceania Football Confederation, or OFC, has many of them. The OFC is the continental association with the least amount of global attention, and it's also the most recently formed association, being established in 1964, with founding members Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and Fiji. With Australia having left the Confederation to join the AFC, New Zealand's football team is the highest-ranked team. The national team is recognized by FIFA as Aotearoa New Zealand, using the indigenous Maori name for the nation. They are joined by numerous Pacific Island nations, including some colonies and territories. One example is the Cook Islands, a country in a unique free association status with New Zealand. And there's also American Samoa, which, unlike Guam, a U.S. territory in the Pacific that participates in the AFC, is a member of the OFC. Also included in the OFC is New Caledonia, a colony of France which recently has been in the news for pro-independence protests. Moving across the globe and moving to a confederation that gets a lot more attention than the OFC, we have UEFA, the Union of European Football Associations. Founded in 1954, the confederation includes many of the countries whose colonies have been mentioned throughout this video. For one example, we can look to the United Kingdom, which actually doesn't have its own football association. Instead, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have their national football teams. This dates back a long ways to the late 19th century, with the 1872 England versus Scotland game being recognized by FIFA as the first international match. This makes the United Kingdom another example of a country whose football associations do not match up with what is internationally recognized as a sovereign country. Instead, the constituent countries within the United Kingdom are given their own football associations. UEFA also includes several countries which are sometimes excluded from the perception of Europe. The nations of the Caucasus region, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan are all members of UEFA, as are Kazakhstan, Turkey, and Cyprus. Very often these countries are considered to just be part of Asia, or at the very least parts of both Europe and Asia, so I think it's interesting that they are included in UEFA. Then there is the case of Israel, whose football association was originally accepted as part of the AFC in 1954, despite the protests of many Arab nations. While geographically this would appear to make sense, the subjugation of Palestinians by Israel made their inclusion a very unpopular choice. Over the next 20 years, they would face boycotts from countries including Turkey, Egypt, Sudan, Indonesia, and North Korea. This only escalated after the 1973 war between Israel and neighboring Arab states. The next year, Israel was removed from the AFC by a majority of voting members. After their removal from the AFC, Israel tried to compete in various other confederations. In 1978, they competed in the Oceania region. The next World Cup qualifying cycle, they were allowed to compete in UEFA, before going back to the OFC in 1986. Eventually, in 1994, they were given full UEFA membership and have since then competed as part of Europe. Because most European states maintain diplomatic relationships with Israel, this has mitigated some of the problems they faced with boycotts in the past. And even as Israel escalates its violence towards Palestinians, and as this video is being made, the people of Lebanon, they appear likely to remain as a member association of UEFA. There is still definitely potential for controversy and boycotts if Israel were to compete on a higher international stage. But the nation has continuously failed to qualify for the World Cup, so it seems kind of unlikely for the time being, especially with FIFA not opting to take actions like they did towards Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. Moving on to associations that are more clearly part of the European continent, there are a few smaller countries that are interesting inclusions. First, there is Kosovo, another country not recognized by a large portion of the globe. After the fall of Yugoslavia, which had given the Balkan region a very strong united football team, Kosovo's Football Association became an independent organization. Since then, the country's political dispute with Serbia left it in a kind of footballing limbo, but eventually in 2016, UEFA and FIFA granted Kosovo full membership. There are also a few territories of colonial powers that compete in UEFA, such as the Faroe Islands, which are controlled by Denmark, and Gibraltar, which is controlled by the United Kingdom. These small nations, alongside other micro-states Andorra and San Marino, make up some of the lowest-ranked teams in Europe. There are also a few microstates which are internationally recognized but do not have football teams, Vatican City and Monaco. For Vatican City, it seems pretty obvious that their tiny population, consisting almost solely of those who work for the Catholic Church, would not make for the best national team. Monaco is a little bit of a more interesting example though, with a bit larger of a population and plenty of resources. But as detailed in this pretty good video from HITZ7s, it wouldn't make a lot of sense for the wealthy in Monaco to allow a national football association to form, as it would jeopardize their club team's European competition. So that wraps up the tour through the various continents to look at the unique and interesting examples of geography in football. We looked at how a lot of different countries, which we don't really consider normally to be sovereign countries, are included by FIFA, and some of them are in very different places than you might expect. Ever since I've started following international football a little bit more carefully, I've been fascinated by who's allowed to compete in it and who isn't, and how that all shakes out. So I hope you enjoyed this video and diving into the details of some of those examples. For me, it was a very interesting process to learn about the history of these countries and their football associations and how that connects to colonialism and how we draw borders. And honestly, what this all kind of underlines is that at the end of the day, these divisions that we draw between ourselves as humans are kind of arbitrary decisions. There's a bunch of different ways we can draw these borders. There's one which is the internationally recognized sovereign countries. There's one which is used for various athletic competitions like FIFA, and there's plenty of other ways they could be drawn if we wanted to. But for the time being, we're stuck with the world we've got, and we are stuck with the football associations and confederations that we've got. So I hope this video helped you learn a little bit more about them, and that's all I have to say for today. So bye-bye.